So, let's start. In her groundbreaking study, Playing the Other, which addresses several internal affinities that link the phenomenon of Athenian tragedy to what Greek society defined as feminine in its gender system, scholar from Decomposing pays particular attention to the architectural organization of the theatrical space as one of the indispensable elements of the theatrical experience that, despite shifting aesthetic paradigms and historical contingencies affecting them, will continue to define the notion of theatre in the West for many centuries to come. Conventionally, for a long time, at least until the end of the early modern period, this space was constructed to represent, I quote, an exterior space in front of the facade of a building, usually a house or a palace, with a door leading to an interior space hidden from view. In this way, not only was the ordinary business of entrances and exits, comings and goings through the door of the house made possible, but also symbolic dialectics between public and private, seen and unseen, open and secret, even unknown and known and unknown was thus produced. According to Decomposing, such mapping of spatial relations is crucial not only for our understanding tragedy as a genre, but also for the epistemological value of theatre as an institution, as it reshaped, among other implications, the rules and realms of social relations between the sexes that assign men to the outside and women to the inside. The theatre thus provided a revealing architectural analogy to the main features of tragic or indeed any dramatic action, which consists in a path from ignorance to knowledge, from deception to revelation, from misunderstanding to insight. In the gender dialectic of outside and inside as organizing principles of dramatic action, which affects not only the shifting planes of reality, but also the tragic self, both mind and body, the house as a central architectural point takes on some intriguingly ambiguous connotations. On the one hand, it is the property of the man and his family line, the visual symbol of paternal inheritance, a place of male power, a sign of sovereignty over the city as a whole and the solidity of the social order. On the other hand, the house is primarily the private domain, the domain of the woman, a place for domestic concerns, the interior space where men, when tragedy is involved, usually go at their own peril, or if they want to succeed in their endeavors, preferably with female assistance. The woman and the house, Titan concludes, appear on the Greek stage as containers for the emotional energies of the self and of society. As both presumably conceal secrets unknown to men, they challenge male authority on multiple levels, social, cognitive, and psychological, and exert persistent pressure, so to speak, on the facade of the Greek male himself. The inaugural force of such a spatial arrangement dictating the theatrical representation of human dealings will gradually lead in the 18th and 19th centuries to the interior of the house becoming the main setting for the action portrayed on the Western stage, and helping to create additional associations between theatre, house, and women. But before we turn to a more recent set of circumstances, let me remind you that theatre companies have themselves tended more and more to set up their projects in a solid building, a house of their own, a walled hole, a globe, if you wish, within the city as a whole. Indeed, a house with its own impenetrable doors, for a long time, as we know, impenetrable to actual women as actors, managers, dramaturgs, playwrights, and directors. Today, of course, the situation has changed drastically in each of these professions, but we have all the more reason to return to Audre Lorde's famous dictum and to ask, to what extent do women playwrights and/or directors qualify as radical in their current approach to the age-old associations between home, women, and theatre, especially given the above-mentioned epistemological, if not political, implications of theatre for the contingent negotiations between the sexes and their value-laden connotations. In other words, in their supposed effort to dismantle the master's house of patriarchal culture, do these authors also radically alter what has historically functioned as one of the master's tools, the house of theatre itself, not only as an artistic practice, but also as a kind of prominent social institution with all the interactional components it entails, its internal politics, its changing relations with literature, the state, and the audience. Since it would be impossible, of course, here To profit of this opportunity to present all the intriguing aspects of theatre work produced in the last 10 years by women dramaturgs and directors in Europe, or even just in Croatia, where they are also gaining in prominence, I have decided to focus on several contemporary performances that deal more or less boldly with the metaphor of the house, by trying to reframe various classical texts from a feminist perspective. Katie Mitchell's and Leo Warner's double vision of Strindberg's Miss Julie, Marina Petkovic-Like's direction of a dance and sound performance, A House on the Cutting Edge, Rebecca Fracknell and Alice Birch's adaptation of Lorca's House of Bernarda Alba, Selma Spakic and Emina Omerovic's interpretation of Shakespeare in The Taming of the Shrew, and Anica Tomic and Ben Ishai's reworking of Ibsen in Nora, or How to Digest the Master's House. As you can easily see from the titles of these performances, 3 of them openly allude to this main metaphor, and one of them, the last one, even explicitly acknowledges thought-provoking phrases, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, which I would like to remind you was formulated at a feminist conference, Second Sex, 30 years later, that took place in New York in 1979. Lord believed, namely, that the conference in question perpetuated the very practices of exclusion that were simultaneously declared as being oppressive of women by the feminist theory, as women of color and women from underprivileged classes were unproblematically subsumed under this general notion. This is exactly the kind of self-implicating consequences I had in mind when I decided to talk about the eventual radical aesthetics as something hopefully issuing from or being homologous to a particular politics, feminist politics. That is also why I will bluntly list the performances I'm going to talk about, from the least radical to the most radical ones, at least in my opinion. I will begin my all too brief overview with one of the 3 most recent examples, the production of Federico Garcia Lorca's The House of Bernarda Alba, which premiered at the National Theatre in London on 16th November in 2023, and in which one of the most reputed British actresses, Dame Harriet Walters, played the role of Bernarda Alba. It is no coincidence that Lorca is included along with Strindberg and Ibsen in the repertoire of the artists I decided to single out, because as you may know, Lorca is one of the modernist playwrights who followed the revolutionary paths of Ibsen and Strindberg in the heated debates about sexual politics that took place at the turn of the 19th century and in the decades that followed. However, what might seem in some ways implicit and hidden in this common interest linking the 3 classics is the centrality of the domestic interior as the privileged setting of most of their plays, which functioned not only as a backdrop to the action, but also as the physical space, as in Raymond Williams' words, I quote, of a means of for living, a whole shaped by and shaping social history. But as it was also a space of familial intimacy, this domestic environment for social action was also intended to take viewers into the depths of the hearts and minds of its inhabitants, reinforcing a further analogy between the home and emotional, or should we say, mental interiority. Given, namely, that the naturalist stage explored the illusionistic possibilities of the newly introduced electric lighting, new associations emerged between the entire theatrical house, the visible stage, the invisible backstage, and the darkened auditorium on the one hand, and the model of the psyche proposed by Freud on the other, with its unconscious, preconscious, and perceptually conscious domains, a triad that, according to David Wiles, conceptually corresponded to the salient features of the late 19th century theatre architecture. Having in mind the aforementioned analogy between the house and the psychic interiority, the director Rebecca Fracknell decided to use a transparent stage house, which represents Bernarda Alba's household, as the dominant trope of her performance. Instead of reconstructing a picturesque Spanish village with a patriarchal ambience, in which a typical female household mourns the death of the old patriarch by having the mother internalize and strictly implement the father's moral prohibitions regarding social freedom and, above all, his daughter's sexuality, the director and her set designer opted for an abstract, modernist construction of several floors consisting of barren rooms in which Bernarda Alba's daughters, their grandmother, and 2 servants spend their claustrophobic lives and have to dream their tragically unrealizable dreams of happiness and escape. As well as depicting, as the program for the performance states, I quote, the escalating tensions in a house where women are complicit in a culture of observation and surveillance that makes them prisoners in their own home, end of quote, the characters in the adaptation, and the set design in particular, also, in my view, alluded to the competing familial and social forces at play in the minds of every woman, indeed in the different stages of a woman's life. As dramaturg Alice Burt, author of the adaptation, broke with the original linear progression of the play's lines and insisted on their mutual overlap, if not confusion, Rebecca Fracknell followed suit by staging the simultaneous appearance and action of the characters and by foregrounding the striking symbolism of the transparency of the set. Despite all these interesting suggestions, and of course, despite the brilliant, forceful acting renditions, the performance remained largely within the confines of the usual, if not traditional, understanding of the use of the entire space of the theatre. Apart from endorsing a mere restylization of the 19th century material conditions of reception, its propagandistic machinery relied heavily on the somewhat outdated hierarchy of the leading lady, the star of the production, who for many, but not for me, I must say, was outshined by the younger part of the female ensemble. My second example, the uncanny, oh, sorry, this is also the slide I should have shown. My second example, the uncanny mixture of dance and sound performance by Croatian director Marina Petković-Liker, entitled House on the Cutting Edge, which premiered on 5th December 2016 at the theatre IPV and so on in Zagreb, was a non-institutional performance project without a classical text as a pretext, without performers embodying characters and their psychological worlds, and without a dramaturgically articulated story to tell. One could even argue that this performance is not a new production of a classic and therefore cannot be part of the series I'm proposing. But on entering the theatre space, the audience looks out onto a barely lit domestic interior in which we see a woman, the dancer Silvia Marci, sitting in the chair on the right, completely wrapped up and entangled in her long curls and woolen threads, trying almost in vain to free herself from her bonds, but eventually succeeding. Next to her, in a dimly lit room on the left, one first hears the sound of some beans or peas falling piece by piece into a bucket, and then suddenly a noise of some kind of drumming bravely makes its way through the darkness, so that when the lights are on, even the fact that the female figure producing it, the musician Kaya Farsi, turns her back on us, we immediately pick up, sorry, here is the, one can barely see, this is the musician in her black dress, turns her back on us, we immediately pick up the beat and realize it issues from a vigorous, if somewhat unnerving, use of various kitchen utensils placed on the table and hanging on the walls of the room. If the dancer, constrained by the hair and wool, wears neutral body colors, the musician wears a black cardigan and red stockings, and we are solicited to read into the two women the derivatives of archetypal characters from fairy tales, old and modern, Brother Grimm's long-haired Rapunzel, and Hans Christian Andersen's red-shoed Karen, if not Dorothy from Frank L. Baum's Wizard of Oz, as performance scholar Susanna Marjanic suggested in her review of the play. The two characters, two separate people, or two sides of a woman split so, as the program suggested, make uncanny contact through, or perhaps even despite, their different means of expression, their different body movements, their feelings of entrapment, confinement, revolt, or anger, their different desires to cope with the increasingly crowded space of the house. Without verbal landmarks, the audience orients itself to these different rhythms and can complement the enigmatic score with associations that coordinate what are perceived as improvised moments, as reactions of one artist to the contributions of the other. If we engage with the framework of the fairy tale, we will see in this house a multiple metaphoric source, encompassing ambiguous interpretive threads of oral tradition, conceived either in its rich connotations of cutting archetypal truths about what Marie-Louise von Franz would call the feminine aspect of individuation, which are then expressed in the characters of the wandering Rapunzel, the rebellious Karen, or the kind-hearted Dorothy, or as a repressive matrix that leads to the perpetuation of female stereotypes, the notion of the household as an appropriate place for a woman, of her domestic duties, cooking and knitting, and her suffering and loneliness, in the inability to connect with other women, even with all the creative means at her disposal, which in this performance could just as legitimately appear as mere contemporary expressions of a desperate female self. The house on the cutting edge indeed provokes our sensibility and refuses ready-made answers, but it also revolves around the well-known aporias that always emerge when female artists like Marina Petko-Člike in her interviews claim to be interested in the feminine principle within the theory and practice of theatre making. Nevertheless, the very fact that her performance took place in the backstage of the official stage space of the theatre, which was rearranged so that the audience is seated there, provided a telling comment upon the marginalization and the stifled creativity of all the female performing artists who are unwilling to comply with the rules of institutional theatre policies. My next example is one of the most famous performances of the so-called live film, a genre invented by the director Katie Mitchell even before she decided to reinterpret Strindberg's Miss Julie in 2013 in her Kerstin after Miss Julie for the Schaubühne am Lehniner Platz in Berlin, whose European tours established Mitchell's worldwide fame as a feminist director. The performance had already been discussed several times, not only in reviews but also in academic articles, but the house of Miss Julie's father was rarely the focus of these analyses, which were mainly fascinated by the multimedia stage that Mitchell and Warner had created by the live production of the cinema version of the play that was projected simultaneously with the actual theatre performance of the adaptation of Strindberg's play that served as material out of which the film was made. Of course, the critics also admired the way in which the cinema version foregrounded the perspective of Miss Julie's humble servant Kerstin, who is abandoned by Jean, Miss Julie's father's ambitious butler, and replaced at his heart by the rich heirs of the house. By making Kerstin the main heroine of the play, albeit mostly silent and passive, and by making her perspective the dominant one, Mitchell forces not only the feminist but also the class point of view for understanding the entire tragedy. Since the play becomes a film about a lonely servant whose life is a series of repeated, unglamorous, often boring domestic tasks, and whose existential thoughts are bound by everyday labor, the audience is led to shift the focus and appreciate a figure that literally splits our vision of class and or gender as the determining factors of one's existence. However, I would like to add here just one neglected aspect of this realignment of the gaze that jolts the spectator out of his or her seat and destabilizes his or her moral choices about the attention he or she will pay to what is presented before him or her. Either the drama of Miss Julie and Jean, or the production of the film itself that takes place at the same time, or the result of that production that is projected above. Mitchell's set is again a transparent construction of the simple and plain interior of the house, consisting of kitchen on the left, center of the stage, a small living room in the middle, and a bedroom in the right center of the stage. The set design was extremely important to Strindberg. He insisted on the kitchen being placed below stairs and wanted the invisible realm upstairs to signal the social and moral topography of the play's class and gender dynamics. It was already to be the undoing of the characters who, according to naturalist poetics, had to be understood as products, even patchworks, of their surroundings. Mitchell, however, unintentionally disrupted this logic. Her film seems literally superior in the aforementioned battle for the audience's attention, as it hovers not only over the partially visible, sordid machinations of the love and class drama that tears Jean and Julie apart, but also over the chaotic production issues, since we were intended to notice the cameraman scurrying around the exterior and interior set with their tripods to make sure they have their camera angle set quickly to be in time for the montage, dragging their cables around, and to see how the camera captures parts of bodies of different actresses in order to construe the filmic character of Kerstin. This ostentatious unveiling of the creative machinery alienates the audience from the emotional substance of the performance, while emphasizing the sublime, illusionistic, but primarily cinematic outcome of the process, no matter how real and life-produced it appears to be. The decomposition of the master's house, both as a fixed set and as a theatrical medium that conditions the critical ideological impact that the set should produce, it certainly happened, but at the cost, is certainly happening, sorry, but at the cost of largely abandoning the medium of theatricality itself and of reaching for modalities that are alien to it, capable of both disrupting the anachronistic nature of theatre and of remedying its shortcomings, such as finally giving the audience the opportunity to enjoy the actor's facial expressions in close-ups. Despite her best intentions, the director, as critics rightly objected, deprived the live theatre of some of its particular strengths, namely physical, emotional, kinetic energies and resonances, and that I would add can hardly qualify as a desirable outcome of a bold feminist dismantling of standard protocols of theatre interaction. My next two examples, as you can already guess, fare much better in the hierarchy of radicalism I have indicated, but the reasons for this already lie in their dramaturgical work on the pieces that they made the starting point of their respective creative processes. Interestingly, both performances are the result of a collaboration between a female dramaturg and a female director, but in the case of The Taming of the Shrew, which was performed at Satire Theatre in Zagreb, it is the dramaturg Emina Omerovic who radically deconstructed Shakespeare's play, while in the case of Anica Tomic and Jelena Kovačic's collaboration for the Deutsches Theater in Berlin, the authors used an already creatively rewritten version of Ibsen's Nora by a young Israeli woman, playwright Ben Ishai. I must also mention in advance that neither of the two female teams of authors knew anything about each other, although in retrospect it seems that they pursued several strikingly similar strategies, one of which stands out in particular, namely the constant simultaneous intertwining and undermining of representation, staging, or to be clear, more concrete, of the supposed identity of characters and actors, of techniques of embodiment and alienation. This constant reminding of the audience of the conditions of production focused above all on the hierarchy of the distribution of roles in the play, because in the theatre, the importance of an actor heavily depends on the distribution of lines assigned to the character he or she is portraying. Moreover, in the Elizabethan period, all female roles were played by men, which allowed the contemporary female authors of The Taming of the Shrew to play with the double distribution of the role of Katharina. Yes. And to thus confront the audience with two possible versions of her comedy. In the production of the rewritten Nora, however, the famous protagonist became an obnoxious theatre manager and narcissistic star actress who rejects the rest of the troupe for their unfounded demands for greater social and theatrical visibility. Both productions have thus explicitly and ironically reshaped the classic text, the first for obvious reasons of contemporary intolerance regarding violence against women, which is portrayed not only in Shakespeare's comedy, but also in its later intertextual history, supposedly only for laughs, and the second for quite different concerns regarding the eventual redundancy of Ibsen's Nora for modern audiences, the need to question its feminist credentials and credibility in the context of contemporary Europe's growing class and racial problems. Although the two performances relied on drastically disproportionate budgets, they again successfully utilized the stage set representing the house. The first one, The Taming of the Shrew, yes, and this is Nora. This time not only as a setting for the tensions of a typical heterosexual couple, and not only as a society as a building metaphor, but also as an allusion to the resistant structures of the canon of artistic representation. The Taming of the Shrew, for example, placed emphasis not only on the theme of psychophysical violence played out in the interiors of the house, but much more on the placement of the house within the larger house of the theatre itself and the framework of intellectual and entertainment tradition that sustained the reputation of Shakespeare's title. The audience could namely see projected in the silhouette of the house, unfortunately I don't have that slide, the titles of numerous commentaries and studies that either defend the humorous portrayal of Petruchio's courtship as a benign parody of the crudity of marital relations, or questioned the rather rich intertextual heritage of the play by insisting on the male cast that originally performed it, and also by focusing on early modern practices of female subjugation that shed an ironic light on the play's supposed parodic intentions. The main thesis of these studies are then tested by the performers. So not only do we see two Katharinas, one male and one female, but we also witness the latter descending among the audience to demonstrate the functioning of an ancient iron device placed around her mouth to prevent her from speaking. The performance ends its repeated interruptions of the dramaturgical homogeneity with Katharina sitting on a huge menacing catapult, which constantly wobbles from bottom to top as a kind of seesaw, so that her monologue can change accordingly between her original final speech, preaching obedience to other women when the actress is down, and her actual rebellious reference to the progressive erosion of women's rights in the current Croatia when the catapult is raised. The same disturbing logic of disruption is at work in Anita Tomic's Nora or How to Digest the Master's House, with its explicit undermining of the smooth flow of the original narrative and the repeated pointing to the unequal visibility of the marginal figures of the postman, the nanny, and the servant in Torvald Elmer's household. The contemporary performance of this rewritten doll's house again brings a nice, transparent little house, onto the stage, but it is literally first remodeled, then divided, and finally dismantled altogether as the production approaches its final epiphany with the naked Nora dancing on its ashes. Here too, the house is not just a specific house of a typical 19th century middle-class patriarch, nor just a very general house of patriarchal social and political order, but also a historically overloaded house of literature, writing, and theatre itself as cultural carriers of problematic and often outdated values and texts, even those that were considered emancipatory for a time, but that no longer endure today and seem to perpetuate hierarchies themselves in their capacity as cultural icons. The problem is, of course, that we cannot simply leave these houses, nor can we simply destroy them. We must, as Ben Ishai puts it, digest them, compost them, allow something creative to grow from their ashes, or at least, as director Anita Tomic suggests, perform Emma Goldman's revolutionary dance on their ruins. Speaking of ruins, and in reference to what 2 days ago emerged in our discussions as values we want to cherish and animate to oppose the current state of affairs, like tenderness, fragility, and care, please allow me to end my presentation with a counterexample, the most radical one, of using the house as a theatrical metaphor, and with a counter question I was forced to face. What when houses are ruined indeed by storms, earthquakes, or such minor catastrophes as a family row around a dinner table? In 2024, in January 2024, in Zagreb Youth Theatre, during the 8th performative conference summoned by the artistic organization Četvororuka, Four-Handed, the audience was requested to visit a miniature interactive installation envisaged by Lea Vidakovic under the title Podrhtavanja, which embraced all these meanings: trembling, fluttering, pulsing, jittering, glittering, vibrating. The installation consisted of 3 mini-stage designs representing 3 disjointed corners of a devastated house: a ravaged veranda with pots of flowers fallen on the floor, a wall of an emptied sitting room, and a corner of a dining room abandoned in a rush, with its slanted dining table still full of barely started meals and a couple of reversed chairs. While strolling helplessly around these 3 material hints at the recent earthquake that hit Zagreb right after the pandemic started, the audience soon realizes that each of these stage settings is complemented by a tiny paper box containing additional miniature items which the audience was free to use and to thus intervene into the mini stage sets. So some people decided to tidy the veranda, some others formed alliances and shared their ideas on how to refurnish the sitting room, while still others decided to tear down the family table altogether. While one may argue that this performance, again, is not a new interpretation of any classical playtext, We should also note that it certainly did take the audience back to the roots of theatre in the child game. As a matter of fact, to a very peculiar and frightful child game, the Fort Da game, the game of absence and presence, of disappearance and reappearance, described in the classical psychoanalytic text, Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, as a game that his little grandson Ernst repeated over and over again in order to somehow overcome the dread of his mother's absence and eventual abandonment. A game that Freud explicitly connected to the puzzling enjoyment of tragic theatre. I cannot, of course, enter into all the refined discussions and later interpretations provoked by this famous passage of Freud's essay and written by such outstanding theoretical figures as Jacques Derrida, Philippe Lacour-Labarthe, Sarah Kaufmann, Giorgio Agamben, or Jacques Lacan, who ascribed to this child game the status of, I quote, a radical articulation, radical creativity, with illuminating consequences for the understanding of human ontological, aesthetic, and ethical condition. Let me therefore just conclude that in the present moment, when our social and political context and even our mother nature seems to be offering nothing but an endless chain of traumas to come to terms with, I cannot help but to see in Lea Vidakovic's invitation to intervene in her little dismantled house a tender reminder of this all-seeing Porta game and of the core human capacity to react to traumas, to produce a gesture, to respond, and to playfully confront our fragility, to embrace the contingency of our existence, and to express our exposure to, rather than our mastery of, the world. Okay.